kollégák! A Fraknói Vilmos Római Történeti Kutatócsoport nevében tisztelettel és szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit. A mai alkalmunkon Kanadából jött történész professzor Shore fog előadást tartani egy olyan témáról, ami elég jól illeszkedik a kutatócsoport kutatási témái közé, leginkább a kutatócsoportnak a jezsuita kutatásai közé, és hát reméljük, hogy sok érdekes dolgot fogunk hallani. Kérdéseket az előadás végén föl lehet nyugodtan tenni, és akkor reméljük egy jó kis disputa keretében további dolgokat is megtudhatunk a témáról. Colleagues, welcome you all in the name of Vilmos Fraknói Vatican Historical Research Group. It's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Shore. He's a historian of the University of Regina. The main field of his research is highly related to our research field about the Jesuits. Dr. Shore, welcome at our university, and I would like to ask for you to perform your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for coming indoors on this beautiful October day to listen to me talk. Before I begin, I just want to thank my hosts for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I also want to acknowledge the Warburg Institute in London, and in particular, Alistair Hamilton, who is a great Arabist and was very supportive of this project. My paper today is entitled Two Hungarian Jesuits and the Qur'an, Understanding, Misunderstanding and Polemic. The first half of the 17th century saw both the peak of the influence and prestige enjoyed by the Society of Jesus, as well as some of the most ambitious translation projects that Jesuits ever attempted. During this period, translation was an essential Jesuit activity. It served, as Peter Burke has put it, as a corporate strategy. It was tied to self-presentation and was intended both for what the Jesuits called nostri, our own people, and also for the larger world. By translating texts from non-European cultures into languages such as Latin, Jesuits could claim mastery over these languages and these documents. However, Jesuit engagement with these texts, and I have to stress this all through this talk, was very seldom straightforward, nor were the motives for translation always openly acknowledged. Jesuits were concerned about the Qur'an, and I will just briefly mention a Jesuit who I've been working on, who is contemporaneous with the Two Hungarian Jesuits. His name is Ignazio Lomolini, and he prepared the first Latin translation, he's a Jesuit from Genoa, of the Qur'an into Latin with the entire Arabic text included. That was in 1622. In addition to the use of the original Arabic and intermediary languages, most typically Turkish, Jesuits who tried to understand the Qur'an frequently relied on earlier Latin translations and on medieval anti-Quranic polemics that had been written by Christian authors. In an era of aggressive polemics within the Catholic Church, Jesuits also found themselves being associated with the Qur'an in ways over which they had no control. There's even an instance of a Jansenist French Archbishop of Sens, who declared in 1653 that the theology of the Jesuits was not the gospel, but was in fact the Qur'an itself. Thus, the decision by Jesuits to engage in the Qur'an was of a fundamentally different nature than from their other projects involving such languages as Vietnamese, Huron, or Mandarin Chinese. These languages that I've just mentioned were at some distance from the political and polemical climate of Christian Europe. Jesuit approaches to the Qur'an, instead, were guided by different objectives. They were, for example, less concerned with translating Christian texts into Arabic than they were with constructing arguments, often in European languages, that refuted Muslim teachings. The audience for which these works was intended included Christians, especially other Jesuits and Jesuits in training, scholastics as they're called. One result of this approach was that Jesuits made few attempts to assemble Arabic grammars or even to make vocabulary lists, which was something they usually did when working with other non-European languages. And most surprisingly, there's little evidence that Jesuits made use of existing Arabic grammars. Jesuits writing about Islam worked in polemical settings that owed much to history as well as to contemporary power politics. A stereotypical set of polemical arguments was available in Europe and could be employed in many different ways. French monarchs, for example, used this medieval heritage in their anti-Ottoman propaganda even while they concluded alliances with the Porte in Constantinople. In the year that the work that I will talk about by Péter Pázmány was published, which is 1605, and the work, excuse my terrible Canadian Hungarian accent, but it's something like Az Moslan Tamat Ui Tudományok Hami Shababak. That's 1605. In the year that that work appeared, a papal interdict against Venice denounced that republic's dealings with the Ottomans, who were being portrayed, not surprisingly, as Christendom's mortal enemies. Adding to the mix of 16th century anti-Islamic polemics were those who demanded the expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain. These writers were not so much concerned with proselytizing, but rather with justifying the expulsion. Finally, and probably of most importance, references to Islam played a major role in inter-Christian polemics during and after the Reformation, when confessional parties tried to denounce each other by comparing each other to Muslims. Luther says, the Pope is a Turk, Catholics accuse Unitarians of being Turks, and so on. It is in this polemical context that the two Hungarian Jesuits we're considering this afternoon wrote about the Qur'an. The first one, his Latin name, he may be quite well known to you. His Latin name is Stephanus Arator, a literal translation of Szántó István. He was born in either Veszprém or Győr counties, which are close to the Ottoman frontier at this time, in about 1541, only 15 years after Mohács. According to one account, his mother, two of his sisters, and a brother were carried off in captivity by Turkish forces. Szántó studied to be a Jesuit, completed his studies in Vienna, and was in Rome from 1575 until 1579, where he served as a boinitentiarius, which is to say a confessor who received the confessions of pilgrims to Rome in a number of languages. He spent time in the missions of Transylvania, and after the expulsion of the Jesuits from Transylvania, relocated to Kláštor pod Novem, which is now in Slovakia, and later to Olomouc in Silesia, where he died in 1612. Now, in addition to a partial translation of the Bible into Hungarian and works on Hungarian history, Arator left a manuscript, Confutatio Alcorani, dated either 1611 or 1610, which was not published until 1990 in second. This work consists of a summary, and I'll just translate the Latin phrases here rather than give you Latin and English. It consists of a summary of the shameful life of Muhammad, followed by certain useful and necessary preliminary points for understanding the Qur'an, and it concludes with the foundations of the Qur'an and this phrase that is so common in polemical literature of this time, the law of Muhammad, the lex Muhammadi. Much of Arator's presentation is a reiteration of tropes that had been developed by medieval Christian writers, but his summary of the Qur'an's content differs from his predecessors in several key points. This is also the case with his phonetic transcriptions of Arabic text. Now, after examining these transcriptions, it appears that Arator knew little or no Arabic. He drew upon, for his translations, the Bibliander paraphrase of the Qur'an, which is ultimately based on Robert of Ketten's work from some centuries earlier. But what is most notable is that he provides a number of transliterations, phonetic expressions of Arabic, which he apparently acquired mostly from a text by Juan Andres, who is an Iberian Muslim who converted to Catholicism in the early 16th century and produced this transliteration. But this work by Juan Andres in Spanish, its title is Confusión o Confutación de la secta mohamédica y del Alcorán. Pretty clear what is meant there. Now, I'll just hit on a couple of interesting bits here. First of all, the copula in Arabic is wa, expressed with one consonant and a vowel mark sometimes. It sometimes appears attached to the first of two nouns or pronouns, and sometimes in transcriptions and transliterations appears attached to the second of two. Arator has no understanding of this whatsoever, and when he reproduces names transcribed by Andres, and wa is often transcribed G-U-A into Castilian, he simply sticks the G-U-A on the front of the name, so that you get lots of Arabic names that suddenly have this wa or wa sound in front. He's just copying. I don't think he knew, basically, any Arabic. There's an even more interesting transcription of a transcription in Arator, which I'll go into a little bit of detail here. Arator quotes in Latin translation from the Compendium Historiarum written by the 11th century Byzantine historian Georgius Kedrenos, which is also taken from 3 earlier sources. A battle is described in this Compendium Historiarum. In this battle, the declaration of faithful Muslims, which is very well known to us from news accounts today, Allahu Akbar, is described in Latin as verba obscena et profanissima praecationis eorum haec sunt ola va kubar. So we've got the Latin rendering Allahu Kubar as Allah in Greek, Omicron, slot, that becomes va in Latin, and then it just is carried on. And then Arator attempts a translation of this strange chant, and he translates it as Deus Vaminor solicit Luna Kubar Magna Sancta Venus. he somehow got the idea that Kubar is the proper name of a deity, and that this deity is cognate in some way with Venus. Just very, very strange and kind of desperately garbled example. There are several other examples. I won't go through the business of reciting his garbled Arabic written in Latin, but I'll just mention that there are places where our man Arator is at variance with Juan Andreas. The spellings vary, and most importantly, the word breaks vary. And this is something that the editor of Arator's work didn't know, but I think it points to the high probability that there was another manuscript circulating, perhaps in Rome, during the years that Arator was in Rome, which may have been based on something other than the edition that is ultimately published as Juan Andreas' Confutatio. The presence of an X throughout these transcriptions, to me, points to a potentially Portuguese source, since this would not have been part of the phonology of either Castilian or some other standard Spanish dialects. But I'm not 100% sure about that, but I do think the idea that there is a possible Portuguese version of this document available, quite possibly in Italy during this time, is quite interesting and probably is worth a further investigation. Now, Arator is working in a tradition where one of the things that a commentator who is Christian must do when engaging with the Quran is not merely to show that it is wrong teaching, that it is a secta, perhaps clearly an unworthy variation of Christianity, but to also play up the immoral aspects of the text, and by implication, the author of the text, as Arator calls him. Of course, Arator doesn't say that the Quran was revealed. He says it is simply a work of authorship. So we have a story that occurs in the Quran. It's the story of Harut and Marut, two angels who came down to Babylon, where they did a lot of bad things, including fornication. Going beyond what is literally in the text and building a sort of sermon around the unworthiness of these two supposed angels in the Quran, Arator writes, and I translate from the Latin, they sought to have intercourse with a man who was drunk, and when he consented, on the condition that one of the angels should take him up for a visit to heaven, the other one arranged to bring him back to earth. This is not in the Quran. This is really something that Arator's done. I did find a commentator, Abdallah bin Abbas, who tells a story that is a bit similar to Arator's. He's a Muslim commentator on the Quran, 12th century, but in this Abbas version, it ends in a murder, not a happy return to earth. So I don't know whether this is a complete creation of Arator or whether he has some other source in hand. Now, before we leave Arator, just a few more comments about him. He did spend a great deal of time in Transylvania. And Transylvania, at this point, did have Muslims traveling through it on more than one occasion. In fact, in Budapest, in the Pázmány Library, University Library, is bound with another book, an account of the Jesuit mission in Kolozsvár at the end of the 16th century, and there's a description of a meeting between a minor Turkish official and some Jesuits where they debate about religious matters. So while we have no proof that Arator met Muslims, he may well have, but there's no evidence that these Muslims presented any original Arabic to him, and most likely they were Turkish-speaking Muslims. Arator was concerned with parsing some of the facts associated with the Quran. He rather generously concluded that Muhammad was not Antichrist. And he acknowledged some positive things about Muslim culture. Among them, cleanliness and hospitality. However, the Quran as an Arabic document is not the focus of his investigation. And since he dedicated this confutation to Franz Cardinal Dietrichstein, who was then Bishop of Olomouc, it is likely that this work was intended for the Catholic clergy of the region, and perhaps especially for the Jesuits, few of whom would have had occasion or skills to read the Quran in Arabic. And I will just point out, since this document is completed shortly before Arator's death in 1612, Olomouc very soon will be caught up in the 30 Years' War. And even if there were Jesuits interested in pursuing Arabic studies, they would have no opportunity, and in fact the Jesuit school is closed twice during that war, and there's a tremendous amount of disruption, which may explain why the Arator manuscript sat for over 300 years in a Viennese archive, basically ignored. Now, I never thought that I would be talking about Pázmány Péter in the university named after him. This morning when I got up, I was a little nervous because I thought this is almost like going to Harvard and explaining that John Harvard owned all these slaves. You might get some support, but you might get, as we put it in North America, some pushback. Nonetheless, I need to talk about Pázmány Péter. He was also, as I'm sure you know, an ethnic Hungarian from Transylvania, as was Arator, but he had a very different life and a very different career from the other Jesuit. He was raised in an aristocratic Calvinist family, converted to Catholicism while still in his early teens, possibly, and I have to defer to the great expert on Pázmány here, but Arator played some sort of role in this conversion. Would that be fair to a secondary role, perhaps?
Exactly, no. Because at that time, Arator was staying in Nagyvárad. But the place of the conversion was the Jesuit college in Kolozsvár.
Wait, he was not there at that time. He was in Nagyvárad.
Arator, yes, but Pázmány studied in Kolozsvár, and in his professorial diary, there is a mention that he was converted by the Jesuits' father in the College of Kolozsvár. This is a historical fact.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Anyway, Pázmány eventually becomes primate of Hungary, and he understood his mission to be to stop the mass exodus of Catholics to Protestant sects and Unitarianism. And I stress Unitarianism because so often in this period, anti-Quranic literature is really not about Islam, it's about, as they would have called them, the Arians. It is about non-Trinitarians who used to be Christians. Now, the work that I mentioned a few minutes ago, published in 1605 in Graz, Osmosban, Tamak, and so on, it's in Hungarian. It's not even in Latin. So it's not intended for Arabs. It's not intended for Turks. Its intended readership is undoubtedly Hungarian. Now, there's a lot of different things in this relatively short book. But there is also an appendix whose title translates as On the Turkish Empire and Religion. In this appendix, Pázmány sets the stage for his discussion of the falsehood of the Turks' religion. With a quote he claims to have found among Calvinist scholia, Potius Turcae quam papistai. Better to be a Turk than a papist. This sentiment, he says, is the reason that the atheists, as atheistak, do not want to fight the Turks. Notable here is the way that all non-Catholics, and most importantly those anti-Trinitarians, are linked to Islam and its holy text, a theme that will occur again in this document. The awareness that Islam was firmly anti-Trinitarian and lacked, this is key, I think, a sacramental theology, makes Catholic apologists all the more willing to see dangerous parallels between the anti-Trinitarian movements that had appeared in Europe and the existential threat of the Ottoman military force. Regarding the Qur'an itself, which Pázmány refers to as Muhammad Tulamania, so it's the science rather than the law, Pázmány's approach is four-pronged. First, a familiar approach, the prophet is denigrated from a moral standpoint. A supposed Quranic passage is paired with an excerpt from the Magdeburg Centuries. Now, this is Pázmány quoting the Magdeburg Centuries, and quoted, as far as I can tell, incorrectly, but nonetheless cited as evidence that Muhammad claimed that he had the right to have sexual intercourse with animals. Followed by another claim, which is referenced to the Magdeburg Centuries, that the prophet knew 40 women intimately in the period of one night. Pázmány, who like Arator seems to have known no Arabic, frequently uses Latin translations of the Quran and then draws on his own Hungarian translations of the Latin. And then the Latin versions come from the Mahometus Saracedorum Principis, which I've mentioned already, which was published by Bibliander in Basel in 1543 and is based sort of loosely on the Robert of Kent translation made 400 years earlier. This Bibliander edition was widely distributed and is probably the version, perhaps translated into a European vernacular, as it was translated many times, that Jesuits carried on their mission to the Mughal court in 1580. That's the first thrust, that Muhammad is a morally unworthy person to be delivering any sort of message. Second point, the accuracy of the Quran in reporting events from the Old Testament is challenged by Pázmány. Pázmány claims that the Quran confuses the stories of Saul and Gideon as military leaders. Referencing a passage in the second surah of the Quran, Pázmány argues that the account in the Quran has confused a text from Judges with the later story in Chronicles about David's victory over Goliath. Now, Pázmány's criticism here may have some substance. When Pázmány claims that the Quran acknowledges that Christ is Spirit and the Word of God, az Istenek lelke idge, excuse me, he is probably referencing a badly garbled Bibliander translation from Surah 4 of the Quran, which begins in Latin, Christo Maria, filio animam nostrum propriae conferentes. In this case, in Pázmány's view, the Quran is making a true statement without even realizing it. Muslims would, of course, disagree categorically, be they Sunni or Shiite, on this point. But that's the second point. That actually there are errors in the Quran, and moreover, the Quran, according to Pázmány, is reporting some things that support Christian doctrine without even realizing that that's what's being reported. This is also something that Nicholas of Cusa did some centuries earlier. The third mode of attack focuses on what Pázmány maintains are theologically indefensible positions of the Qur'an. He asserts that Allah and the angels pray for, and I'm translating the Hungarian suffix ert as for, they pray for the Prophet Muhammad. And Pázmány gives a citation from the 43rd Surah. This is all confused. The 43rd Surah does not make any sort of reference here. It is apparently the 33rd Surah, the 56th ayah, you might call it a verse. That's the closest that I can find that matches this claim. And in that Surah and ayah, the key word is Arabic plural imperfect verb, yusamula, which is commonly translated as to send blessings, but which is linked to a triliteral root, SLW, transliterated, some of whose derivations refer to prayer, but this is really stretching it a good deal here to make this claim. The Quran's supposed claim that God would treat a mortal in this way, that God would pray for a mortal, is, in Pázmány's view, unacceptable. In a similar vein, Pázmány objects to a passage from what he says is the middle of Surah 19, asserting that when a person prays, their soul leaves their body. Again, we seem to be off by a count of 10 surahs, because the closest reference is not Surah 19, but Surah 9, which in Bibliander's translation reads Animas suas ipsis incredulus extract, which might fill the bill, but is not a perfect fit either. Now, Pázmány, in his dissection of the Quran, uses a lot of non-Muslim sources that are also non-Catholic. He says that he's quoting Calvin, and his Latin citation reads Calvin, Turkey, Liber Quater, and so on, but I cannot identify what this work would be. And again, do you know of a Turk? The Turkey's Liber? I don't know. I've never heard of it. So this may be misunderstood hearsay. It may also be manufactured nonsense. It's impossible to tell. But in any case, there are a number of examples where Pázmány will point here and there and say, this source, this Lutheran source, this Calvinist source, shows these things about the Quran and about its author. Now, Pázmány wrote in Hungarian, a language which potential apostates from the Catholic Church could read. For him, the Quran is little more than a rhetorical asset by which he could assail the Protestants and Unitarians while legally calling attention to the Ottoman presence in the empire. And I would say this is really the fourth prong of Pázmány's attack, which is to say, even if you are unimpressed with the moral bankruptcy of Muhammad, even if you don't care about these theological points in any detail, ultimately the Turk, and remember, Muslim and Turk are interchangeable terms in many cases here, the Turk is a threat to Christendom. And their way of doing things is a threat to any and all Christians. So, we step back now and look a little bit at these two works. Both of them reflect the almost exclusively Christian audiences for whom both of these 17th century Jesuits wrote. And I would argue that both of these works, and also the Lomellini translation in manuscript that I mentioned at the beginning, completed in 1622, that the commentaries in all three of these works say much more about the state of Christianity in Europe than they do about Islam or the Quran. Arator's work, which was aimed at a Latin literate and possibly clerical readership, had been intended for publication. We even have the name of a publisher in the manuscript, but like Lomellini's translation never went to press, for reasons I've already speculated on. There's the added complication that the Qur'an is on the Index Prohibitorum during this whole period. And any investigation of the Qur'an by any reputable Catholic figure has to be couched in terms that show that I'm looking at this document, but I recognize that it's depraved and wrong before I even start. So there's a tension between the Jesuit tendency in general to be accurate in translation and the reality that this is not a botany text. This is not an algebra text. This is not a text that can be viewed with any sort of neutrality by any Catholic clergy person of this period. All right, so that's sort of where things stand with Arator. By contrast, Pázmány's work, Pázmány Péter, authored by an already highly visible cleric renowned for his command of a linguistically isolated vernacular, I'm referring to Hungarian, of course, this work was guaranteed a readership among Hungarian speakers, even if the work was inaccessible to Catholics elsewhere, to say nothing of Muslims. In most cases, Pázmány's attacks merely reprised points raised by earlier Christian polemicists. Yet the ultimate purpose of Pázmány's arguments must be located in a religiously diverse and politically fluid Hungary, recently divided in three ways into Ottoman-occupied territory, Habsburg Royal Hungary, and an independent and officially pluralistic, remember, Transylvania. Neither writer, notably, is interested in or even shows an awareness of the Hadith tradition associated with the Qur'an, nor do they make use of rabbinical sources that other writers on the Qur'an from this period in the West use for two purposes. One is rabbinical sources often support Christian arguments, indirectly or unintentionally. Secondly, knowledge of Hebrew, a cognate Semitic language with Arabic, is sometimes employed by those who know it to untangle or unpack obscure Arabic words. That doesn't always work, of course, but you might find a triliterate root in Hebrew that you think explains the meaning of an Arabic word. But our two Hungarian Jesuits don't do this. Both Arator and Pázmány in their approach to Islam look backwards rather than forwards in Jesuit history. They also look towards late medieval polemicists such as Raymond Wu or Denis the Carthusian, in particular Denis the Carthusian. And nothing in either of these men's works anticipates the more empirical and objective approach taken by Ludovico Maracci, not a Jesuit, but an Italian clergyman, when he produced the definitive Latin translation of the Qur'an over a 30-year period and published it at the end of the 17th century. The works of Arator and Pázmány indeed say a great deal about Jesuit literary culture and about late medieval use of that literary culture than on a burgeoning and growing Arabic scholarship in the West that is found in Germany, the United Kingdom, and in the United Provinces of Holland. These two Hungarian Jesuits don't engage with that. Nevertheless, with all these caveats and criticisms, there are several distinctive features that these two Jesuit engagements with the text of the Qur'an show. First among them is a focus on the meaning of specific words and phrases within the text. Pázmány, in particular, seeks to use literal and carefully cited, if erroneously cited, quotations from the Qur'an to identify and rebut what, in his understanding, are the broader claims of Islam. For example, he cites the Qur'an as evidence that Muhammad was sent as a teacher, but not one who compels belief. In the Latin gloss here is tu es doctor, non coactor. You're a teacher, not a forcer. Rather than attacking the prophet's morality, social status, and personal credibility, here, Pázmány jumps over here and takes Muhammad, quote unquote, at his word, and says, well, this is what you say you are, after saying that he's a lying, morally despicable person. But here, you've just said that God told you that you are a doctor, not a coactor. So we jump to the literal acceptance of certain words. I think this literal, word-for-word approach, the roots of it can be found in the Ratio Studiorum, the Jesuit program for education, which took its final form in 1599, which of course both Arator and Pázmány would have been steeped in their Jesuit formation. The use of short passages is often suggested in the Ratio as a way of winning debates. Also, Jesuits of this period, whether they're working in North America or in Asia or even in Ethiopia, they often prepare word lists. I can't really call them lexicon, but they are word lists, and so the breaking down of languages into small units is a typical Jesuit strategy at this time. Complementing this word-by-word approach is Pázmány's moral indictment of the Qur'an as a dangerous work that promotes not Arianism, but atheism. And here, Pázmány goes even further than other critics of Islam who describe Islam as a secta, a spin-off, a split-off from Christianity, an Arian split-off. And Pázmány prefers to say that this is simply something that leads to atheism. So to move towards a conclusion, Arator's and Pázmány's engagements with the Qur'an represent what I would call a pre-modern Christian view of Islamic revelation. While commentaries accompanying later translations that I've mentioned by first Molini and then Marachi are certainly hostile to the claims of the Qur'an, both of these latter two Arabists recognize the demands the text makes on a translator who's trying to render the document into Latin. Both of these latter translators grapple with the linguistic difficulties and with the often specialized vocabulary of the Qur'an. And here, this is a very important point. I'm still a baby in my Arabic studies, but my babyhood has taught me that one of the great challenges is the number of key words in the Qur'an that appear only once in the Qur'an. They are rare in classical Arabic, and in some cases it's very hard to even find cognates with them. So when you're going about a translation and you run into one of these rare one-time words, there's many things you can do. You could turn to context, although that can lead you astray very easily. You can try to analogize from the root. You can step back and simply take your own theological position and apply it to what you understand to be the author, as it is called of the Qur'an. But you may simply draw a blank on a very basic word. And I'll just mention one very quickly. The common Arabic word for elephant, even today, is fil. Al-fil, the elephant. But it only occurs twice in the Qur'an, and there's no context. And if you don't know that you're talking about an elephant, there's no mention of ivory or that it's really big or tusks, nothing like this. You're at a total loss. And so these two men can't really engage with those types of examples. and I mentioned Lomolini simply transliterates the Arabic and walks away, isn't even going to try. But these are very, very typical problems when you do this word-by-word approach. The two Jesuits, however, to speak on their behalf, they do at least use Quranic texts, albeit then mistranslated and sometimes misattributed, in their arguments, which places them in a very different position from medieval anti-Islamic literature, which very often simply spun tales that could not even be linked to a Quranic passage. However, ultimately, Arator, most particularly, fails to engage epistemological issues, and he never attempts, and remember he is a Counter-Reformation Jesuit, he never attempts a defense of the Trinity in the face of the Quran's rejection of the Trinity. Pázmány's seeming lack of curiosity about the organization in the Quran, I think, can be attributed to three factors. On a practical level, Pázmány composed this work in either Shore, which I mentioned is now in Slovakia, or in Graz in Austria, apparently without access to even the bare handful of Arabic Qurans that had been acquired by civil or religious entities. Even if he had wanted to make a critical study of the Quran, Pázmány would have had to assemble scholars and texts, a project that neither his location nor resources would likely have supported. In any case, such a project would have been a low priority. Secondly, while Pázmány undoubtedly wanted to demonstrate the failures and fallacies of the Quran, the context in which he wrote his work is markedly different from those framing either interconfessional debates, Catholics versus Lutherans, for example, or the debates that Jesuits very politely conducted at the court of Akbar, the great Mughal, where everything is done with a certain amount of openness, and if not courtesy, at least awareness that if you throw a punch may come back at you. So Muslims are not part of this conversation. This is simply one side of a conversation. And what is more, none of Pázmány's intended audience was likely well disposed towards Islam, and very few probably needed to be guided away from it. Rather, my interpretation is that Pázmány's criticisms of the Quran are an opportunity for him to exhibit his gifts as a master of Hungarian prose, uniting readers of varying or wavering beliefs in opposition to a huge common adversary, the Ottomans. Now, in addition, the direction of Pázmány's translation efforts, like Arator's, is different from the three major Jesuit linguistic projects that I mentioned at the beginning: the Huron in North America, Mandarin, and Vietnamese. Each of those undertakings sought to take Latin, and in the Vietnamese case, a few French examples, take documents in those languages and translate them into local vernaculars, for example, catechisms. Instead, Pázmány wrote in his native vernacular to fellow readers of that vernacular. This is a conversation among Hungarian speakers regarding a document which he knows only through a Latin translation. And it's generous to call it a translation. A Palestinian colleague of mine, I gave a talk about Bibliander, and the colleague said it's a paraphrase. And he was smiling when he said that, but that's barely a translation. Anyway, that's what Pázmány uses. To construct his argument, Pázmány uses Latin sources, excuse me, which he translates into Latin for his readers. One of the consequences of this sort of approach was that classical Latin, which was already the fulcrum of Jesuit book culture, was now set up as the gateway through which conceptual and lexical categories, as identified in the Quran, must pass. This is sort of the key point that I want to make, is that Latin is totally privileged here even if you want to read Pázmány and in some way want to take an objective and less hostile view of the Quran, the journey you're going to have to go on has to go through the Latin portal, because that's the means. So, the loss of any understanding of the Quran as an Arabic text is, in my view, as a result, almost total. Finally, Pázmány wrote in the Baroque Jesuit tradition of identifying an other that was going to serve as a foil in the society's story about itself, in its self-presentation. Such a foil might be a Jew. Stiff-necked Jewish men are a great foil in Jesuit literature. A classic story is a Jewish woman and child flee a stiff-necked Jewish man for the safety of the Jesuit house. You will find the story in Prague over and over again. So the other might be a Jew. The other might be a savage pagan, a Mohawk, a Muggle, something like that. Or, in the case of the Quran, a pseudo-prophet, a false prophet. In the case of the false prophet, there's an issue of gender, too, because this false prophet, Muhammad, as characterized by both Arator and Pázmány, is the antithesis of the sort of man a Jesuit education was supposed to produce. He is, and again, this is sort of taking the prophet's words and stretching them a bit, the prophet Muhammad is illiterate, even in his own language. To take seriously such an individual as a writer is not only to betray Christianity, but to deny the value of the entire educational project the Jesuits are trying to put forward. And Muhammad's alleged immorality makes him a complete other for the brotherhood of celibate Jesuit priests and coadjutores temporales. It's completely on the other side. The Quran, therefore, in these two documents, lurks off stage, you might say, a palpable present, its philological characteristics masked by the overlay of one or more intermediate languages. The immediate preoccupations of both Arator and Pázmány are determined far more by confessional dynamics and political realities surrounding the act of writing than by any desire to grasp the meaning of the Quran. However, I must concede this is not due to a lack of awareness of the importance of the Quran or of the language it brought into existence. Rather, the crisis that both Catholicism and more broadly Christianity faced in the early 17th century seems to overshadow Jesuit efforts to explore the Quran and stands in very vivid contrast to the work of Roberto de Nobili, a Jesuit, an exact contemporary of our two Hungarian Jesuits, who traveled to India and who did engage on a very deep level with the sacred Sanskrit text, the Brahmanas. However, the distractions of European confessional politics cannot entirely explain away the restricted nature of these literary encounters with the Quran, considering the Jesuits were willing, in so many other contexts, to engage with non-Christian literary works, the works of Confucius, to name only one. Further study of the dynamics shaping the history of the Austrian province of the Society of Jesus, in which these two works were composed, will, I hope in the future, shed light on the factors that inhibited a more serious, and if I can say it, more modern approach to the Quran than one that we find with our two Hungarian Jesuits. Thank you for your attention. And I'd be happy to take questions, comments, challenges, anything.
How did this idea came to deal with these subjects for you? With the Hungarian subject, you are
Well,
Hungarian.
my grandparents, my last name is Shore. I won't go too far into my biography, but my grandparents' name was Siu, and they came from Papa 100 and more years ago. So there was a bit of heritage. But then very briefly, in the 90s, I had done some writing about Jesuits and about university reform in North America. But a Jesuit took me to lunch one day. They're very persuasive men. And I can't tell you the exact words that he said after so many years, but when he was done, he convinced me to go to the former Warsaw Pact countries and see what I could find out first about Slovak Jesuits, Jesuits in Prague, and ultimately I get to Budapest, and then the next step is Warsaw, and so on. So that's my answer. I was very lucky. If I'd attempted this 20 years earlier, you'd be out enjoying this evening and we wouldn't have to sit through a paper because none of this would have happened. The 90s were an opening, and that's where I began.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What is the reception, the scientific reception of your research, this research in light of the Islamic danger felt and its experience nowadays?
That's a very good question. I'll give you a multiple answer. Among Jesuits and people who study Jesuits, unqualified support in all ways. I've also lectured at the Cambridge Muslim College in the UK and given presentations at the International Institute for Islamic Thought outside of Washington, D.C. And I should also mention that I'm a clergyman of the Anglican Church of Canada, although I was not wearing the collar when I did these things. But in other contexts, there is politeness, but also a sense that there's some ownership of the Qur'an as a text. And there's also a bit of trickiness in that if you begin to explore how someone translated a rare word in Arabic, classical Arabic of the 7th century, you are very close to investigating the philology of that word, not just the translation. And since the traditional position has been that the Quran is perfect, was received perfectly, and is immutable, unchangeable, to brush up against a philological analysis of a passage in the Quran, particularly if one is not a Muslim, is to go close to wearing out your welcome in some contexts. I will also tell you, on a lighter note, if you ever attempt a task like this, do not sit in an American airport with an Arabic book. I was pulled aside. My computer was swapped. I had to spend $150 to fix it later. I barely made my flight, and I was pretty scared. These are very tense times, and even with the news that we're getting day by day, Saudi Arabia versus the United States, it continues to be very tense. And I'm not sure I'm completely addressing your point. The other thing that's very complicated is there's a great deal of money available to study the Quran, but much of that money comes from a certain collection of sources, and it comes, if not with strings, with expectations. And I produced a lecture on a related topic that was sent by Moodle, kind of like almost like a Skype, and it was presented to a class at a Saudi Arabian university, 2 classes, women and men, separate classes. There were no questions. There were no questions. Everyone just sat there. So that it's, on the one hand, it's very exciting because there's a great deal of contemporary interest. There's a conference in Berlin in December about Christian translation of the Qur'an with absolutely top-ranked scholars, and much important work will be done. So there's a great deal of excitement, but there's also far more tension than there would be if I were investigating the Iroquois documents that Jesuits produced, where it just isn't. Does that come close to? It's a great opportunity. I get to be here. I'm going to Naples tomorrow. It's a lot of fun. They're wonderful places to travel to. But I don't know where all my material will be published, and the Berlin conference, to my knowledge, is almost exclusively non-Muslim participants, which is a shame. So we have a way to go. And I might mention, I live in Canada, but I'm a US citizen, so this is all very personal stuff to me. The role of the United States in the Middle East and its relationship, in particular to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Very complicated stuff. But thank you for asking, because that's a big part of the process. You know, you're on a plane and someone asks you, what are you doing and where are you going, and you have a story to tell, and sometimes they're very quiet and they don't ask another question, and sometimes they ask a lot of questions.
További kérdések? Nincsenek.
Thank you very much.